Hello everyone! Did you know making a complete video game entirely by yourself is one of the hardest things you could ever possibly do? Game development is very complicated for a number of reasons that people are unable to conceptualize due to probably just not thinking too much about it, and gaming status as an activity for children leads people to believe that if it's for children, it's probably not that deep. This line of thought, combined with sentiments from game development influencers saying that anyone can make games, it's easy, contributes to the infantilization and disrespect of game development as a whole. I agree with the sentiment that anyone can make a game, but these motivational statements seek to mask the truly monumental effort required to produce a game. And there's a reason success stories of solo projects like Lethal Company and Stardew Valley are incredibly rare and deserve your utmost respect. So today, we'll be going over just how much it takes to produce a game entirely by yourself and establish realistic expectations for ourselves and others. Let me start by stating the obvious. Not all games are equally complex. It's true that you can make simple and small games like Pong or the Unity tutorials where you control a ball that rolls around and picks up some points and it ends. There's nothing wrong with that. They're great beginner projects that you should start with, but this generally isn't what people mean when they say they want to make games. So it's disingenuous to point at these projects as a reference point for the skills expected of a solo game developer. Usually what people are interested in making is the more complex projects, such as that one game idea your coworker had that's a full sandbox MMO with realistic survival mechanics, or a massive RPG where every choice truly matters. In this case, the complexity grows from something you could make in an evening to something that would take your entire lifetime. Just look at Star Citizen, a game with over $600 million in funding, and yet it is far from finished, despite being in development for over 10 years with a full team of people. We must come to terms with the fact that we will never be able to make something as grand as Star Citizen by ourselves due to its monumental scope, but it would also be disingenuous to point at something that's impossible as the reference point for what's expected of a solo game developer. Surely our expectations should lie somewhere in between these two ideas, so let's start by analyzing what some would think to be easy games to make. But first, something a little different. This video has been sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is the best way to learn math, data science, and computer science interactively. Brilliant offers thousands of lessons from basic to advanced, so if you're just getting started learning math or are brushing up in your linear algebra for graphics programming, Brilliant has something for you. Even if you don't know where to start, that's not a problem. Brilliant customizes its content to fit what you need. Just take a short quiz when you sign up, and Brilliant will match you with lessons that fit your interests and level of expertise. I personally use Brilliant whenever I need a quick and accessible refresher on math concepts that I haven't worked with in a while, and I think it's a great starting point for someone looking to improve their math skills for game development. I appreciate that Brilliant makes it easy to find lessons on topics you're looking for, which some search engines have been making that harder recently. Be sure to try out everything Brilliant has to offer with a free 30-day trial and 20% off an annual plan when you visit brilliant.org/Acerola or click the link in the description. Thanks so much to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Many people see game development as a technical field, which isn't really the case. In fact, you can make a game just fine without much technical knowledge at all. People tend to look down on Game Maker as too simple and lump it in with the category I mentioned earlier, but without it, we would not have games like Amori or Undertale. It's a fact that these two games feature few complex mechanics, and many would point to them as a game that seems easy to make. But is that actually the case? Sure, you don't need any real programming knowledge to make either of these games, as both Omocat and Toby Fox learned programming on the fly for them. So from an engineering standpoint, it's simple. Now you just need to be a skilled enough game designer to create a base mechanic that's interesting enough to be fun, but simple enough to be expanded upon throughout the game through boss fights that aren't too easy or too hard, different enough from each other to be exciting, and of course, are actually enjoyable. Then you just need to be a skilled enough writer to craft an interesting world, cast of characters, and the story itself. Then you need to be a skilled enough illustrative artist to design the characters, illustrate numerous character portraits for them, and of course, draw all the environment assets themselves to fill the game. Next, you need to be a skilled enough audio engineer to produce sound effects that don't suck. Finally, you need to be a skilled enough musician and composer to create an original soundtrack for your game that repeats without being repetitive and properly communicates the intended emotion of scenes. We will not consider the case of localization, where your game needs to be translated into multiple different languages for release in different countries. So while you can get away with having little programming skill, you still need at least a working knowledge of 5 entirely different creative disciplines. But many would still think these two games are something they could make themselves in a year or two. In reality, despite being attributed to one person each, Omori with Omocat and Undertale with Toby Fox, they're not solo projects. Omori was fully funded through Kickstarter, which Omocat used to hire a team of people to help with programming, writing, music, sound effects, and art. Omocat had a large part in everything except music and sound effects. Even with the funding and team of people, it still took 6.5 years to finish because yet another skill comes into play: effectively managing a team. Undertale was also funded on Kickstarter. Toby Fox did the game design, programming, story, and music, and hired Temmie Chang as the main artist responsible for most of the game's concept art and sprites. With 2 people, Undertale took nearly 3 years to complete. Perhaps a lesson is to be found here. Given our previous standards of a working knowledge of each discipline, that's not enough to create these games. Omocat is an incredibly skilled artist and hired others to cover for their lesser strengths. Toby Fox is an amazing musician and composed most of the soundtrack pretty much first try, and a lot of credit for Undertale's success is owed to Temmie's charming character designs. So if your dream project is in the realm of games like Omori and Undertale, something you would assume is low scope, it's not that you should just give up and go home, it's that we should acknowledge the skills and time it takes to achieve such a goal. Like I said earlier, programming skills are not very important in this context. If a belief that game development is highly technical is stopping you from trying to make what you want, then there's no need to worry. All you need is your creativity. Start turning your narrative ideas into short stories. Do a portrait study or 2 every day. Sign up for those music lessons. Torrent Adobe products. The time will pass anyways, so you may as well start today and imagine where you'll be a year from now when your personal growth is more intentional. Okay, enough with the motivational statements. What about games that actually were made by one person? 13 years ago, Eric Barone, better known as Concerned Ape, graduated from university with a computer science degree. Unable to get a job, Eric started working on a personal project to improve his programming skills and job prospects. Inspired by Harvest Moon's inability to produce a good game in the series, Eric announced his intent to create a spiritual successor in 2012, and, due to how much support was received from the internet, decided to focus entirely on production of the game. 4 years later, Stardew Valley was released on February 26, 2016, with the game's programming, game design, pixel art, music, sound effects, and story all done by Eric. Clearly, his hard work paid off, with the Wikipedia article I just read to you citing Stardew Valley as one of the greatest games of all time, as well as one of the best-selling games of all time. When contextualized with what we just discussed, Eric's accomplishment is no small feat, and he deserves his spot in video game history, especially considering he worked over 10 hours a day for most of the 4 years it was in development. So what made it possible for Eric to create Stardew Valley when Omori and Undertale were less reasonable solo projects? If you recall from earlier, the general level of competence needed to create those games involved little programming skill, but high output in all the art disciplines. For Stardew Valley, I would say it's nearly the opposite. The systems of the game are deceptively complex, and it's really easy to accidentally break a game that runs on such a fixed schedule. Testing this game is probably a nightmare. This was also 12 years ago, when programming resources were far less abundant on the internet. Beyond the game design though, not to sound too critical, but I think Stardew Valley has a pretty accessible art style. Pixel art was all the rage back then, so there was a lot of resources for it. The sound design is fine, the music is pretty good, but certainly not on the level of Undertale, and the story and characters exist on a pretty minimal level, just enough personality for people to identify. Overall, I would say that for someone to make Stardew Valley, they would need a decently advanced knowledge of programming, with a novice intermediate level of all the other disciplines. Eric Eric had a CS degree, so the most difficult part of Stardew Valley was covered by his existing expertise, and he had a bit of art experience already, so the 4 years of development was probably spent improving on his lesser strengths to meet his standards, like I said someone would have to do if they wanted to make Omori or Undertale by themselves. It's also important to note that Stardew Valley went through multiple complete redesigns, so if some of those could have been avoided, or a more concrete design document was created initially, then it could have maybe taken less time. Unfortunately, sometimes the software engineering guys are right. Considering Eric's initial conditions, a CS degree generally takes about 4 years in the United States, so if you wanted, you could say that Stardew Valley really took about 8 years to complete, since without those first 4 years, then he would not have the knowledge needed to make the game. So if it's your dream to make a game like Stardew Valley, and are starting from little to no skill in these areas, you should not hold yourself to the standard of something like Stardew Valley's development cycle, even though it's a reasonably scoped solo project for someone like Eric. It takes a long time for everyone to develop these skills, so when you're on your own journey and see that some game was made in a year or two, don't forget to consider all the effort that went in before its conception. But Acerola, what about Lethal Company? It's true, Lethal Company was made entirely by someone born in the 2000s. Zeekers. Not much is known about Lethal Company's development cycle yet, but considering Zeekers' previous game, It Steals, released in 2020, and Lethal Company released in 2023, you could assume a 3-year development time. Lethal Company is very smart, because it has intentionally low standards for its presentation and functionality, because that's what the design asks for. I think that more people should design for less work, rather than the other way around. These low standards enable the game to be 3D, which is decently rare for indie games for reasons you might not have thought about. It's very true that pixel art and illustration are difficult and time-consuming to learn in their own right, but medium to high-fidelity 3D art is considerably more involved. You've got the sculpt, the low poly, the texture mapping, the texturing, the rigging, and the animating. Each of these tasks is usually an entirely different job at a studio, so a lot of man-hours can be dedicated to just one asset. If you're a solo developer and your game is aesthetically diverse by design, you could be spending many months on modeling alone. This is why asset packs are so valuable and widely used. It saves more time than you could possibly imagine. Lethal Company subverts this time sink by doing the bare minimum for its assets, which enables much of the game's comedy. People will sometimes handwave Lethal Company as lazy, but if it tried any harder, it would be a far less entertaining game. Mechanically, Lethal Company is definitely not simple on account of it being multiplayer. Never believe what any programmer trying to be cool says. Multiplayer stuff is really the devil. Overall, I would say that if someone wanted to make Lethal Company, they'd probably need a good deal of programming and game design experience, with bare minimum working knowledge of 3D asset pipelines and simple music skills. I'm pretty sure Lethal Company uses stock sound effects, and the story draws pretty heavily from SCP. Like Eric, Zeekers gained these skills over a larger period of time than 3 years. He started out making Roblox horror games, with his first release in 2015 and another in 2016. 4 years later, he moved away from Roblox and released a Unity horror game in 2020, It Steals, which if you notice, looks suspiciously a lot like Lethal Company. So if I had to guess, the next 3 years were mostly spent on learning and developing the multiplayer systems of Lethal Company and combining it with the visuals of It Steals. In the macroscope, Lethal Company has a collective 8 years of personal development poured into it, just like Stardew Valley. An unfair comparison though, because Stardew Valley didn't release in early access like Lethal Company. Zeekers' progress as a game developer is something you can learn a great deal from. If you wanted to make something like Lethal Company, it makes a lot of sense to make a lower scope, single player version of it first, because even that could take you years. At this point, either you haven't cared about anything I've said, or you're drafting a comment right now that's like, wow, this really demotivated me. I never want to make a video game now. Don't worry, because I'm just like you. Contrary to popular belief, you do not need to make a whole game by yourself to be a game developer. As I've demonstrated, it takes a lot of time to develop the skills to make the kinds of games that people would generally want to make, and then it takes even longer to actually make that game. It's become quite clear why solo productions like Stardew Valley and Lethal Company are so rare, because how many people have you met that are willing to work 10+ hours a day for 4 years straight on the same project? It's truly simply an unreasonable expectation to cover all the bases yourself in an industry as multidisciplinary as game development, and anyone that does produce a successful commercial game all on their own deserves the highest of praises. If you are someone that is daunted by this mountain of work, then that's like totally normal and reasonable, so my suggestion for you is to find what you like and specialize instead of forcing yourself to take it on all at once. All of these skills provide value in game development one way or another, and it's when our skills come together that games can be made. The secret is that once you learn one thing, you're usually going to learn new things even faster, because learning is a skill just like everything else. I am often asked when I am going to make a game, and my answer is, not anytime soon. I just like graphics programming too much, and so I would rather continue making graphics tech demos. Admittedly, I am lacking in a lot of needed skills at the moment to meet my own personal standards. While I could confidently solve any engineering problem given my programming experience, I'm not the best writer or game designer. My art skills are pretty rusty as I have not painted in years, and I'm not very proficient with 3D software as my job is to make the 3D software, not use it. I do have a working knowledge of sound design, and this year I started working on my music skills. I've been practicing piano for 7 months now. I've been thinking about a spiritual successor to From Dust a lot lately, so if someone was holding a gun to my head, I guess that's what I would make. But after everything I've said in this video, I'd probably just tell you to shoot me. As usual, a huge thank you to all my current patrons. Also, I'll be at SIGGRAPH in Denver this month thanks to Nvidia flying me out. So if you're around, come say hi. Anyways, that's all from me. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.